Studying history isn't weird. Over the years, the things people told me were true at the past turned out to really not be the case. Most of the eras I thought I knew about as I studied further were the exact opposites of how they were portrayed. This video is about this. This is the second part of the video I made about historical misconceptions, since the list of them is basically endless. This is since our views in the past reflect our understandings of the present, and thus we're emotionally invested in how we tell the past. Like last time, for each of these there'll be a little blurb at the end explaining why this myth exists, alongside some book source in the topic. The Battle of Normandy was an epic part of world history, as the Americans clawed off the beachheads like Utah, Omaha, and Juneau through the hedgerows while facing tough German resistance. This video is sponsored by Warpath, where you can refight these epic battles. Warpath is a marvelous storyline inspired by real World War II events such as the Normandy landing, defense of Moscow, and others. Warpath's a game where you can have realistic World War II units, whether tanks, infantry, artillery, rocket launchers, etc. The firing system is also good, meaning try not to get your tanks hit from the side. Warpath is both strategy and real-time player versus player combat. The battles are all in real time, so watch every single movement and maneuver as it plays out. You can always ally with people as well, and try to build awesome alliances in order to crush your opponents and expand your territory. The game's also stress-free. Unlike the other games, if you fail you can start somewhere else in the map and try again. It's also free to play, and you can get free gold which you can use for development and gives you the upper hand in battles. With all of this, what's stopping you from playing today? Also, there's a special What If Altist giveaway. The players with the top powers and who invite the most friends have the chance to win some awesome prizes like a PS5, Switch, and Amazon cards. Use this bonus code to receive a ton of in-game rewards and click the link in the description to download Warpath. You're in command now. Number 11. Peasants were always poor. The general view of the Middle Ages and the pre-industrial world in general was that there was a super-rich nobility with all the power and money, and then a massive downtrodden peasantry barely getting by with no middle class in between. You had everything between cottage owners who only owned a tiny garden and worked for other people to support themselves on one side, and massive peasant landowners on the other who held large amounts of their own land. Something a lot of people misunderstand is that the lines between peasant and nobility were far more permeable than you'd like to think. In France and Spain especially, a decently well-off peasant could just buy a title of nobility. In places like England or Germany, they often became members of the gentry class who lived like nobility but didn't have the title. The other side of this is that you had a massive population of poor nobility, or people who had to go into debt to even afford a horse and a crappy suit of armor. These often sank into the peasantry. In other terms, there were many peasants who were wealthier than the poorer members of the nobility. Peasants often didn't live in the abject poverty we imagine they did either. The general level of peasant poverty was heavily dependent upon the population density versus arable land. Peasants in general in the 12th, 15th, and early 18th centuries were often well-fed, housed, and prosperous, while those in the early 14th, mid-17th, and 19th centuries were often on the verge of starvation. There's an opposing myth to this that the peasants in traditional and older societies lived in harmony with each other in rural, bucolic charm. The truth is that these medieval peasants argued over what we would consider to be tiny pieces of land, were constantly jockeying over slightly higher legal positions, and had what are by modern standards terrifying murder rates. Number 10. America was always a single nation. Before the American Civil War, the U.S. was referred to as these United States, not the United States. This was since the U.S. was not viewed as a single nation, but as a collection of different smaller nations and ethnic groups shoved into a confederation. It's interesting to read pre-World War II books that always describe American history as a mix of different ethnic groups with different ways of life, such as Yankees, Scots-Irish, Southerners, etc. Even today, the best way to genetically split up the largest groups of Americans is which of the centers of the 13 colonies their ancestors came from. In a lot of ways, the different cultural reasons of the East Coast colonized the rest of the country. Late 18th century Ohio, for example, was actually politically divided between sections owned by Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut, who populated the state with people from their home states. An example of how culturally disparate America was in the colonial era was that a New Englander might say I ain't, a Pennsylvanian I'm not, and a Southerner I bean't. The American colonies viewed themselves as closer to England than each other, with Britain being the unifying force. Each of these areas worshipped different sects of Protestantism, bred with people of their cultural group, had different economic models and different governmental structures, or for all intents and purposes were different nations. This doesn't even include weird enclaves you'd never think about. Large parts of 18th century eastern North Carolina was Gaelic-speaking, for example, due to Highland Scottish immigration. The area around New York City was majority Dutch-speaking into the mid-19th century. In fact, the only American president with no English ancestry, and who didn't speak English as his native language, Martin Van Buren, came from this area. We do early America a huge misservice by treating it as a single thing. The different parts of the country worked together to their own self-interest and only gradually became integrated into a broader whole, if at all. Number 9. Plato was a genius. Basically every history of Western philosophy will start with the assumption that Plato was a genius. Plato's almost always the first chapter, and people will talk about how philosophy followed from Plato. I always find this amusing, since literally everything Plato says turns out to be massively incorrect. First of all, Plato's main theory was in the immutable form, so that the underlying perfect nature of things comes from the ether and that everything's just a pale imitation of the real immutable forms. The story of the cave is about how the general population remains looking at the real physical world and remains foolish, while the few brilliant philosophers who can look beyond into the ether are the geniuses. Similarly, the summary behind the idea of the Republic is that we should have a very highly selective process to get a class of genius philosophers who should rule society in a totalitarian manner, with control of everything between child-rearing to art. First of all, you can easily see why this guy is so well liked among philosophers, in that he flatters the hell out of them. In terms of actually getting things right, there are other people who we should really be giving more credit to. The Milesian school of philosophy based out of modern Western Turkey figured out heliocentrism, that the world was round, the concept behind atom theory and evolution. If anyone deserves the credit for founding Western philosophy, it should be Thales. I've also heard the argument that Plato was incorrect, but he put Western philosophy on a good trajectory. This is incorrect, however. Plato's notions held back classical civilization by thousands of years. Plato's idea that the real physical world was of limited importance resulted in classical science stagnating, believing things that could have been easily proven wrong by easy experimentation. The Greeks invented the computer, steam engine, and weird mirror-powered weapons and did nothing with them since dealing with the real world was against ungentlemanly behavior. Number 8. The US lost the Vietnam War. The narrative that the US lost the Vietnam War and the US never could have won is surprisingly pervasive. The truth, as always, is way more complicated. So, the big fact of the Vietnam War was that the US couldn't invade North Vietnam itself due to the fear that China would start a nuclear war. Thus, the war was basically both sides trying to wear the other down. The US did this by racking up casualties, the North Vietnamese by getting the American people to lose the will to fight. What happened was that the US media lied wholesale about the conflict, saying the US was close to winning the whole time. However, the North Vietnamese launched a Tet Offensive, and the American public was angry that the war wasn't in fact close to finishing like the media said it was. It didn't matter that the Tet Offensive was for all intents and purposes an American victory. The Vietnamese lost so many men that even their top government has disclosed since that if the war continued much longer they would have given up. However, the US lacked the will to keep fighting the war and so pulled back first. The US ended up losing the war, but that really wasn't the US military's fault. It was the US public will's. On a separate note, there's a lot of mysticism about the Vietnam War that stops making sense once you compare it to Korea. Almost everyone says Korea was a justified war, but most people say that Vietnam wasn't, even though they were ostensibly the same war. A communist North Asian land country invades a capitalist Southern American ally. Vietnam's extolled for US atrocities and how horrifying it was to fight in it, but Korea killed 2 million more people, and fighting Chinese human waves in the freezing weather sounds just as horrifying to me as fighting the Viet Cong in the jungle. The big difference was that Vietnam was televised and Korea wasn't, meaning that the American people saw how horrible war really is, and that Korea was fought by the silent generation and Vietnam by the boomers. The silent generation grew up in World War II and the Great Depression, and so were inured to hardship, while the boomers grew up in the greatest era of prosperity ever. Number 7. Literally everything about pre-colonial Africa. There's a right and left-wing mythical version of what pre-colonial Africa was like. The right-wing version goes something like, it was a bunch of savages who needed Christian civilization, and the left goes, it was a super advanced and civilized region that the Europeans destroyed. Neither of these is correct. The first thing to bring up is that Africa is so huge that the regional diversity was immense. Africa was simultaneously primitive and advanced, since you could find places like Tanzania where 100 years ago, 60% of the land was uninhabitable due to disease and the rest was inhabited by illiterate Iron Age societies. Similarly, you had places like Mali that were highly developed, literate, and cultured societies, as technologically developed as anywhere in the Old World during the Middle Ages. In general, there was a string of states that had a medieval level of development ringing the southern side of the Sahara Desert, and most of the rest of the continent were illiterate Iron Age cattle herders, and the far south was hunter-gatherers. Like every other era in history, for all the positives there were also negatives. Yes, Buganda was a highly developed centralized state, but it also did massive Aztec-style human sacrifice. West African societies gave women high status, but also had large amounts of polygamy that created large male death rates. The general summary you can make is that the African empires in the pre-colonial era were generally as technologically and governmentally advanced as those in medieval Eurasia. The Mali Empire is one of the largest and wealthiest in the world. Dahomey had a very effective system of illiterate bureaucratic kingship. However, as institutions went, they were quite primitive. No African state had a strong intellectual tradition, almost all were caste societies without any real ability for social advancement. You never saw parliaments, scientific revolutions, or cultural movements that spread to the rest of the world coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. Also, another thing people forget about pre-colonial Africa is that the Europeans weren't the only colonizers. The Muslims operated the largest slave trade in history out of here, with traders operating in the central DRC and had a far higher death rates than the European. The Muslims also likely circumnavigated Africa before the Europeans did. The Omanis controlled the whole east coast of Africa, and the Egyptians had conquered everything down to the Congo by the early 19th century. Number 6. The IndoAryan Invasions never occurred. This isn't really a myth propagated by Westerners, but having dealt with Indian nationalists on this channel, it's a big myth there. To start, there were massive migrations around 2000 BC starting in the area between modern Ukraine and Kazakhstan, spurned by the invention of the light chariot that conquered from Ireland to Bangladesh, eventually resulting in languages like English, Latin, Russian, Persian, and Hindi. First of all, unless you're a complete ideologue, this is just proven. We have genetic proof that in the majority of North European ancestry is from Indo-Aryan roots, as is downwards of half of India's. We found mummies in Western China from this era with red hair and tartan. Similarly, archaeology also bears this out, as does mythology and linguistics, all of which point towards a shared cultural root somewhere in the Western steppe. Indian nationalists often say this never occurred. They don't like the idea that India's foundational culture could have come anywhere except India, especially from European-like peoples. It was also an unpopular theory in the West for a while, since the West didn't like the migration model of history after World War II, and since the Nazis believed in the theory. Number 5. Russia's always been a terrible place to live. We sort of have this myth that Russia's always been a depressing place to live, where it's always been oppression, starvation, and vodka. However, this wasn't always the case. Take the Middle Ages, for example. 12th century Russia was one of the more prosperous areas in Europe, with developed property rights, cities, and most Russian states being parliamentary. Serfdom only started to show up in Russia in the 17th century, and then only the northwestern part of the country around modern Moscow. Under the Tsars, there were many eras of prosperity and freedom. People from the rest of Europe were often shocked at how well-fed Russians were in the 15th century, for example. Similarly, early modern visitors mocked the Russians for bathing so much and resolving disputes in court rather than through duels. Life on the Siberian and Ukrainian frontiers was filled with smallholders living in prosperity in a fairly egalitarian manner. Central Ukraine and parts of Siberia opted to join Russia in the 17th century voluntarily, since Russia was not seen as a terrible country to join. Non-Slavic peoples were often treated well if they converted to the Orthodox Church. The Tsars were also far less morally corrupt than we often give them credit for. An interesting example I think about is that much of Russia's ruling class were German speakers in the Baltic, and so in the 7 Years' War, occupied East Prussia actually got along with them pretty well. Early 19th century Russia was actively considered democratizing, and the Kerensky government during World War I also got pretty close. Tsarist Russia ended the Central Asian slave trade, and the Stolypin reforms of the late 19th century actually gave the ex-serfs their own land. Russia was also industrializing at a rapid pace, one of the fastest growing economies in the world before the Communist Revolution. Lots of people think Russia was in terrible shape before communism, but in fact, nearly every metric of life, with the exception of urban amenities, declined in the Soviet Union in the period before World War II. Number 4. Europe got wealthy by exploiting the rest of the world. This myth annoys me, since for large segments of the population it's just viewed as completely true, but it's so easy to disprove. First of all, Western Europe was already the wealthiest place in the world per capita before it started colonizing the rest of the world. You can actually use national incomes in 1500 in the Eastern Hemisphere to predict incomes today, since as the era of Western hegemony ends, we're basically going back to the pre-modern norm. Secondly, there's no way to look at a correlation for empire and national success. When the Spanish took all their gold from their empire, most of it ended up in Italy and Spain, whose economies stalled while those in England and the Netherlands were those that went through massive revolutions. I once did a correlation for countries involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and it was actually negative. The countries most involved were places like Spain or Portugal that are now the poorest in Western Europe. Meanwhile, the wealthiest countries in Europe are and have often been places with no or practically no colonial history or involvement in the slave trade, like Germany, Switzerland, Northern Italy, or Scandinavia. Similarly, once you look inside these European countries, this makes even less sense. The centers of industrialization in England was in the rural and northwest, while the ports most involved in the colonies were places in the south like Bristol and London. In France, the center of industrialization was in the northeast, while the areas most involved in the slave trade were ports like Nantes, Le Havre, and Bordeaux in the west. This gets ridiculous with the scramble for Africa. Practically none of the African colonies gave more money than the Europeans got out of them. Similarly, when the Europeans left after World War II, Europe went through a massive economic revolution, while Africa and most ex-European colonies went through a 30-year active decline in standard of living. By the time we get to the 20th century, the colonial empires were basically economic liabilities. There are some counterexamples that I think could work, like Spain totally did fund its military for over a century by exploiting Latin America, while you could make the argument that the conquest of India helped British industrialization, but I generally think this is window dressing. Number 3. Whitewashing the worst atrocities. Hitler was a bad guy. Everyone reasonable can agree to this. However, we often forget that Hitler was only the 5th worst mass murderer in history. What's really shocking is that the 4 people ahead of Hitler actually have massive supporter bases and apologist communities in the modern world. There are 2 kinds of people who killed more people than Hitler: communists and Mongols. For communism, this is generally easy to explain. The world's never come to the conclusion that communism is morally abhorrent. Stalin and Mao often get off the hook since large parts of academia had wished Marxism had worked and have the same affection for communism that right-wingers often have for extreme nationalists. Also, much of this is powered off the intelligentsia's envy of the wealth and power of those who are less intelligent than them. That's the point of communism. If they cared about helping the poor rather than hurting the rich, they'd pick a model of moderate socialism like modern Sweden or France's, which is a far better track record. For the Mongols, it's generally that they were far away and long ago, and their achievements as conquerors are so badass that we can't ignore them. When those 40 million deaths were 800 years ago and in countries far away, we can turn away from that dark side and focus instead on how genius and manly Genghis Khan was. One of my favorite forms of music, for example, is Mongolian metal, and I can admit to daydreaming about riding circles around the Chinese firing arrows into them. It just seems unfair to me that we don't condemn these clearly sociopathic mass murderers. Killing a son of a rich farmer is just as bad as killing someone for being Jewish, since they're both killing someone over something they're born with that they can't control. We believe that human life is equally valuable in the modern world no matter when or where, and so how can we say life in 1940s France is more valuable than 1240s Iraq? In addition to this would be the Taiping Rebellion. This is the 3rd bloodiest war in history, killing anywhere between 20 to 40 million people in 19th century China, or more deaths than World War I. It was a civil war between almost Christian fanatics trying to seize power against the Manchu monarchy. It's a huge war almost no one's heard of. Number 2, the Roman Empire was a bastion of progress. In alternate histories where the Roman Empire never falls, a common side effect is that technology advances far faster. This always confuses me since the Roman Empire, with the exception of some architecture, most of which they indirectly took from the Etruscans, invented nothing. The Romans were incredible administrators and achieved a high degree of civilization, but you struggled to find a single real technological advance in the 1,000 years between 500 BC and 500 AD. The Romans distrusted anything new, with the Latin word novus for new having the double meaning of weird and creepy. The Romans valued education a lot, but they inherited the same issue as the Greeks, and they thought that doing anything practical was ungentlemanly. The Romans did nothing to improve agricultural productivity, for example, which would have reaped enormous rewards for their entire society, and from which they actually knew methods like drilling for seeds or growing clovers to improve soil quality. The Imperial Romans tended to have the most inefficient style of agriculture possible, with slaves and cattle. Turning much of the Mediterranean to massive slave ranches is a big reason why southern Italy and Greece are as messed up as they are now. Another way this misconception is framed is that the Romans brought a higher standard of living for the population. That was true for city dwellers, but you have to remember that the Roman Empire was 90% rural. For your average Egyptian peasant, nothing changed when the Romans invaded. In fact, in many parts of Western Europe, the fall of Rome actually resulted in improvements of quality of life and health. This is part of a broader issue we have with the Roman Empire. We generally imagine the Roman Empire to be upper-class toga-wearing Italians. However, this discounts the empire's massive diversity. In 100 AD, the average inhabitant of the Roman Empire was a Celtic or Greek-speaking peasant. The Roman Empire was often like little urban dots of Greek and Latin culture in a sea of rural native inhabitants. Number 1. The medieval Catholic Church was regressive. The medieval Catholic Church ended slavery and created the first code of human war rights in 11th century Europe. It kept the Greek philosophic teachings alive in monasteries during the worst years of the Dark Ages and helped spread literacy to much of Western Europe. Latin Christendom was the only major civilization in medieval Eurasia that didn't keep upper-class women secluded and had the largest role for women of any of the major civilizations. Before the Black Death, the Catholic Church stood against witchcraft and forebathing. Similarly, the Catholic Church also created the idea of individualism by banning cousin marriages, so the previous clan structures fell apart and were replaced by individual nuclear families. An interesting survey looked at church documents in Italy, which found that the switch from referring to people as members of clans into individuals took place around 600 AD and occurred only in the areas under the Catholic and not Orthodox Church. The Catholic Church also created the scientific revolution in a lot of ways. Medieval Catholic philosophy was that since God made the world, by searching for the truth, one was finding God. This started the path towards Western science. Meanwhile, the other main Eurasian civilizations all held that studying ancient textual documents, like the Sutras or Quran, was superior to looking at the outside physical world for truth. In the meanwhile, before the Black Death, the Catholic Church was the biggest funder for the people we would call scientists today. The Catholic Church was also a massive economic powerhouse. Monastic groups like the Cistercians were workhorses that often dominated their regions through sheer hard work. The Templars also founded much of Europe's banking system. Another important way we misconstrue the medieval Catholic Church was by saying it was prudish. Medieval Europe was in fact far less prude than the modern world. Families and friends would have sex in front of each other in many circumstances. Henry V had sex with a French princess in front of his finance ministers to show that the treaty with France was fully consummated. Sexual hospitality was common in much of Europe, and whole families and friend groups would sleep naked in the same bed. I'm not saying the medieval Catholic Church was perfect. There were some absolutely disgusting excesses that aren't justifiable, but you can't paint it in a purely negative light. Before we end, I have an announcement. I've started a partnership with educational tech company Takeoff. I'm going to be making quizzes about the info and Woodafaltist videos, where the top winner of the live quiz can get real money prizes of around $25. For example, the first one will be coming out in about a month and will be based off these 4 World War II videos. Click the link in the description to check it out, or alternatively check out Warpath, the link to which is in the description. Besides that, if you enjoyed this video, you can also check out my merch where I've got all sorts of cool t-shirts, mugs, and maps. Alternatively, check out my Patreon. On my Patreon, you can get exclusive fan videos, cool maps, and to read the first 3 chapters of my Cultural History of America and the first 11 of my History of the World. I guess to end, if you liked that video, you can like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. As always, thanks for watching and have a great day.